So it's hard to believe, but today is the first Sunday of a new year. It's kind of strange for me to say it out loud. 2020. Anybody else struggling with the idea that it's 2020? And to make it a bit more complicated, on social media, there's this huge debate going around about whether or not 2020 marks the beginning of a new decade, or do we have to wait until we finish 2020 for the beginning of 2021 before we can bring in a new decade? Anybody thought about that? It's all over social media right now. You might want to Google it when you get home, and maybe you might be convinced one way or the other, but I'll tell you, I'm under a traditional school of thought that today, that 2020, the beginning of 2020, is indeed the beginning of a new decade. One person at 9 o'clock wanted to argue that. Whatever. Not going to waste my time. If you want to wait a year to celebrate a new decade, go for it. I'm always fascinated with these kind of new beginnings because often there's this opportunity to think about transition or change. For Heather and I, at the end of each calendar year, we make a list of things we hope to accomplish in the upcoming year, and we also evaluate how well we did the year before. It seems to me that the conversation is the same every year. Heather says, you start. So I quickly name things like quality time with each other, more financial security, an opportunity to maybe be generous, growth in my understanding of what it means to do ministry, and of course, more time for woodworking. And then Heather, she starts to add to the list. She gets about 3 or 4 items down, and then she pauses, and she begins to think, and she thinks real hard, and she pretends like this is some fresh, brand new idea that she's never said before. And she says, well, I think we should work out more. Every year, the conversation is the same. We need to be healthier, Heather says. And every year, I resist. But I am proud to share with you today, church, as of yesterday, in the year 2020, I have ran 3 miles. That's 3 more miles than all of 2019, and I'm done. But I have to be honest with you, I am fascinated with the focus that we put on New Year's resolutions. For some reason, we have convinced ourselves that there's something special that happens in the transition from the last day of December and the first day of January. When in reality, there's nothing vastly different between December 31st and January 1st. And yet our culture has built in this whole false sense of understanding that this is the one time of the year that we can talk about change and transition. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about transition. As you know, transition can be positive or negative. Change can be planned or unexpected. Some transitions, they happen without warning, and they can often be quite difficult. In the case of an accident, a death, a divorce, a job loss, or a serious illness. And yet, life transition can sometimes provide a positive opportunity to restart. And it can be celebrated by the birth of a child, the joining together of a marriage, the purchase of a house, the start of a new job, or perhaps the celebration of a retirement. Life transitions can be challenging because they force us to focus on a spirit of unknowingness. Life transitions call us to leave the familiar. But sometimes, for some, life transitions can offer this sense of wonder that is life-giving. This in-between space is this welcomed opportunity to wait for what is yet to come. Transitions give you an opportunity for newness. Will you join me in prayer? Holy God, as we gather in this sacred space to hear your word, to reflect on what it means to live in a spirit of transition and change. Speak to us today. Amen. The gospel story that Lynn shared just moments ago is a story of transition. For the Jesus story, and particularly when we focus on Mary and Joseph, today's story is the end of one season and the beginning of living into a moment of transition. Today's story, with the exception of when Jesus was a teenage boy in the temple, is the last story we hear about Jesus until he begins his ministry around the age of 30. Can you imagine the kind of changes that happened in Jesus' life from when he was a small boy to when he was 30? Can you imagine the kind of changes and transitions that Mary and Joseph were forced to deal with as parents? Today we get a glimpse in a very normal part of transitions for the Jewish tradition. Like faithful parents, Mary and Joseph, they observe this long-time tradition and ritual of having Jesus circumcised, named, and presented. In the midst of these ritual acts, Jesus was blessed by Simeon, who claims Jesus' life is set to walk down a prophetic path. What Simeon saw in Jesus, even as a young boy, was hope. But he also makes it clear the hope that we find in the Christ child does not prevent us from having to deal with the challenge of change. Simeon understood that the relationship that Mary had with Jesus as mother would vastly change over the course of Jesus' ministry. Any parent in the room, you understand this. Your relationship with your children, they change as they grow, and thanks be to God for that. Amen? Simeon looks at Mary and says, "This child is destined." Even at a very early age, Simeon was preparing Mary for what is yet to come. Simeon understood that Jesus' work is bigger than any single person or relationship, and this is true for any God-led change. God-inspired transition is bigger than any one of us. But you already know this. Many of you could easily argue that 2019 has been a year of transition, a year of change, a season of living in the in-between spaces of life. Over the course of the last year, can you think of any significant changes in your life or in our world? Absolutely. Each of us can easily name more than one transition or change that has happened in 2019. And I know for my family this is true. It has been a year of change, and the same has been true for the church. As a church, we have journeyed the difficult transition from one long pastorate to another. And in the last 6 months, you have been forced to live in this season of change, and it hasn't always been easy nor fun. But if I can be honest, I believe that the work that we've done in the last 6 months, the change that we've experienced in the last 6 months, is nothing compared to the work that God is calling us to in 2020. It is nothing compared to the season of transition and change that God is asking us to deal with in the upcoming months. And yes, this can be scary, but it also can be incredibly exciting. And I, for one, cannot wait to see what God does. One of the most single Googled word of 2019 is how. The single most Googled word of 2019 is how. That's right, the how question. The how question is often thought to be the most important question in this in-between moment of life, in the season of change and transition. In my theology, I believe that God welcomes these kinds of questions, but when you ask questions of God, we are inviting God to respond in surprising ways that sometimes can be a bit uncomfortable. And you see, in my experience with God, the how question is often the very last question God answers. Because anything worth doing, any God-sized dream, simply looks impossible on paper. So God doesn't waste God's time by trying to explain the how. And if God did, we would probably turn and run in the opposite direction. Do you think Mary would have said yes? Do you think Joseph would have stuck around had God taken the time to explain the details? For us in the midst of this season of transition, we must seek God's guidance, but we cannot let the how paralyze us from the opportunity of living into what is yet to come. Because when we find ourselves in this moment of transition, in this in-between space, often what God is asking us to do is to let go of control and let God lead. A few years ago, I was listening to a political analyst report on his experience of the 2016 presidential race. He was mainly focusing on his struggle to create space for meaningful reflection. He quickly named all the various tasks that he was responsible for. His schedules consisted of meetings and interviews and presentations. He shared that after he finished one thing that he was responsible for, he was quickly forced to move on to the next thing on his to-do list. This morning, I want to suggest that the experience of this political analyst is not much different than many of our own experiences. As we navigate the various challenges of transition, many of us are moving at an extremely intense rate and are unable or unwilling to reflect on our previous experiences, much less dream about future possibility. And because of this, we struggle to let God lead. Ultimately, I believe this is problematic. Because when we ramp our day-to-day up with an unsustainable pace, we miss out on the opportunity to live in the in-between space of life. And we find ourselves in a season such as today, we quickly become uncomfortable because we simply do not know how to live in transition. Often we fail to recognize the gift of change, the opportunity to be reflective while focusing on new possibilities. Or to say it differently, church, in this moment, I believe that God is asking us to simply listen. To listen for God's voice. So my question today is simple. Are you going to let the how question keep you from finding hope in the Jesus story? There's no judgment in this question because it's something we all struggle with. It's something I struggle with. Trusting God in the in-between spaces in moments of transition is incredibly difficult. But like Mary and Joseph with baby Jesus, we are called to live in the season of change with a willingness to simply listen. God is asking us not to allow the how question to consume us, but rather to learn a new way in trusting God with all things, as we as a church and as individuals are forced to deal with difficult transitions and changes. Might we have the faith of Mary and Joseph? Together, might we live in this season of change with a willingness to trust God with all things. Amen.